Hey everyone, this is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. Happy Friday, everybody. Today we are going to do some horoscopes for Saturn in the sign of Aries. This is because Saturn is turning retrograde, its very first retrograde in the sign of Aries over the weekend. Now, some of you know earlier in the week I mentioned that at the very last moment we lost all of our content for this week because of an audio and microphone malfunction. So what I'm doing today is I'm going to replay for you some horoscopes that I made and covered back when Saturn first entered Aries. We're going to revisit those horoscopes today as a way of covering Saturn's retrograde in the sign of Aries. I had made some wonderful horoscopes for you that were fresh and new. Unfortunately, I lost them. And so replaying some episodes this week has been a way of catching up at the very last moment. I do apologize. It's not the norm. We'll be back to our usual content production schedule with next week's creative content. And so today, I think what will be interesting is some of you may actually remember these horoscopes and you can think back about them, but they are still very accurate from the standpoint of the kinds of topics that Saturn in Aries might be bringing up for us right now as Saturn reaches a very critical turning point in its cycle. Before I turn it over to this rewind of the old horoscope episode on Saturn and Aries, let's take a look at the real-time clock. So here we can see that over the weekend, if I go forward to Sunday, July 13th, you're going to see that Saturn has got the S under it. In my program, that means Saturn is stationing to turn retrograde. Neptune recently turned retrograde as well. Late March, Neptune entered Aries. Late May, Saturn entered Aries. So it's been from late May all the way through about the middle of July that we've gotten a taste of Saturn moving direct in the sign of Aries. Not much. Now let's take a look at this retrograde period that we are going to be in while Saturn is in the sign of Aries. We'll focus on different horoscopes for Saturn and Pisces later. But for now, this takes us up to about September 1st. From here, the middle of July, the 13th through September 1st, Saturn is retrograde in Aries and already bringing about changes and revisions within that whole sign house of Aries in our birth chart. That will continue all the way until early September, at which point the story changes as Saturn enters Pisces. Now, taking this forward a little bit more, Saturn's direct motion will come through later in the year. So we see Saturn turning direct toward the end of November, beginning of December in late Pisces. And then it enters Aries again through direct motion in about the middle of February of 2026. So it is unique to think now about May all the way up until now and what's been happening in that whole sign house of Aries. I encourage you to reflect on that with this rewind episode of some old Saturn into Aries horoscopes. But then consider, what's the turning point? What's the revision that's happening right now within that whole sign house, within the topics of that place? We will consider this again when Saturn comes back into Aries in early 26. But between now and September, we're getting a little bit of a deepening of the first initial paragraphs of this new chapter with Saturn and Aries. So that takes place between now and early September. Anyways, what follows are some old Saturn and Aries horoscopes that I did right before Saturn entered Aries. So let's listen to these, and I hope that it will give you something good to consider going into this weekend Saturn retrograde. All right, that's it, and we'll see you again soon. Bye. Let us now turn our attention to the real-time clock. Yesterday, we took a look at Saturn in Aries, and I think that it was a pretty good discussion of Saturn in Aries that allowed us to think about what it means when Saturn goes to the Airbnb of Aries. What kind of things does Saturn order? And then how do the hosts, in the case of Aries, that's the Sun and Mars, provide for the guest, Saturn? And that exercise is one that as I was mentioning yesterday, you can utilize for any kind of planetary delineation when a planet is traveling through any sign, especially those that it doesn't rule, right, when it's a guest. So today what I want to do is consider something a little bit deeper and more spiritually focused and give you some thoughts about your horoscopes. We have looked at Saturn in Aries through a number of horoscopes already over the past months. So in some ways, we're just trying to reiterate and keep present in our minds and in our daily meditations the upcoming change that Saturn is about to make I think that it's effectively like, if you know a sacred teacher or a special person is coming to your house or to your local temple or church, you sort of spruce it up, make sure that it looks nice. And I think that's what we're doing on this channel. We're just making welcome a space within our hearts for, yes, even Saturn. But this begs the question. Sometimes we hear this word evolution, and some months ago I had a colleague of mine on the show named Ari Moshe Wolf, and he came on and we talked at length about the differences in schools of astrology, the evolutionary school of astrology, which is a more recent modern school in astrology, and ancient Hellenistic astrology being practiced in a modern context today. We kind of discussed different philosophical approaches to the practice. One thing that I think all schools of astrology have typically appreciated as a core philosophical value or spiritual value is the idea that what we are looking at in a birth chart is something of the karmic, this lifetime, the current karmic conditions of the soul, the fate, the destiny of the soul, all sort of interchangeable words in ancient philosophy. So on that level, when we think about the word evolution, typically what comes to our mind is this idea that the soul is here to evolve spiritually through the raw material of a lifetime, and that we can see some of that raw material in a birth chart. And not only that, that each transit that we consider through the birth chart as the life goes on is offering a kind of testimony to where the soul is at in its current evolution. I don't see any discrepancy or I don't see any real difference philosophically between the way ancient astrologers looked at the evolution of the soul, even though they might not have used that particular language, and the way that modern evolutionary astrologers do on just a very basic sort of macro. Okay, sorry about that. Somehow I just disappeared. I accidentally clicked the button on my mouse and I disappeared. So anyway, as I was saying, I don't see a big difference in how modern astrologers in the evolutionary tradition versus say, ancient astrologers looked at the soul. Yes, we're here to learn and grow spiritually through the raw material of our lives. And the planets can be used as a way of mapping out what kinds of themes and topics are likely to be a part of that evolution. Before I go further with giving you some ideas about how Saturn in particular may always be asking us to evolve, which we'll use as prompts for these horoscopes, I want to just take a minute to explore the word evolution. So the etymology of a word is really a way of thinking about its roots historically, where the word comes from, and some of its original meanings. Because what happens often is we start taking a word for granted. We use the word regularly, and then we start baking in assumptions that may or may not be very close to the actual roots of the word. I find that refreshing on etymologies helps me connect to the language so that language isn't just dead and functional, but is alive and sort of oracular. When we meditate on words we use frequently, I find that even though some of them, like the words death and rebirth, for example, two of my favorites, quarter jar words, that they can stay alive somehow when I spend time looking at their esoteric roots, their ancient historical roots. So on that note, what does evolution mean etymologically? So it comes from the Latin word evolutio. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it means an unrolling or an unfolding, originating from the verb evolvere, which meant to unroll. And what I really liked was the almost like there was one little note here that I read in one of the spots online that I was looking at the etymology from. This noun meaning unrolling or unfolding refers to the act of unwinding or unfolding something like a scroll. And I thought, ooh, see, I love etymologies because it connects me to an image like the unfurling or unrolling of a scroll. And for me, when I think about spiritual evolution, I don't just glaze over and find myself surrounded by, a billion crystals in some new age bookstore, just like, just glazed over. But I suddenly have a connection to the word now. I think of something being unfolded like a scroll that's being read. Don't you ever get that sense yourself? I certainly do, that as your life is happening and you're going through certain seasons or phases of growth where certain themes become really noticeable, it's as though you're unfolding or unrolling a scroll, a sacred text that has to do with this raw material of a life. The raw material is the means by which you're going to grow and evolve spiritually, the way in which you're going to grow or unfold. It's as though there are these moments when we suddenly are able to read the intended plans or themes for our life. And I don't always feel like I can see that. Like sometimes I'm just in it and I can't zoom out to see, oh, this is the material this chapter of your life is kind of about these themes and these topics. That's why astrology is so useful. It allows us to see something of that script. Astrology, in a sense, is evolutionary insofar as it allows us to sort of unroll the script and look at some of the sacred language that is destined for us. So, on that level, I don't necessarily think that we need to think about evolution in terms of like an ascension through levels, rungs on a ladder, moving upward towards some peak state of enlightenment. I think of it more like a story. There's a story that's been written just for you, just for me. And astrology in certain moments allows us to unroll the script and look at that. And with that understanding of the chapter that we are living, I think comes greater ability to co-create within it, we might say, or to just be a more conscious participant. This is why this channel also constantly supports an animistic view, which is a participatory view. Every stage of your life is like an animal that's alive, and how will you tend to it? That's a level of experience or thinking about experience that most of us, we forget to access it because we're so in it. But when we see experience as a kind of spirit that's visiting us, well, then it's that scroll again. We're able to see something. So just a few thoughts on the word evolution. Let's look at 3 questions that Saturn, I think, is always providing us. And then we're going to look at the whole sign house placement here in our charts to give us a clue as to where Saturn might be showing up right now more specifically. So, number 1, I think Saturn is always asking us, where will I mature? How will I grow wiser? Where will I become just a little bit more focused, especially where focus is required for the sake of the story, for the sake of that which is unfolding? I don't believe that focus is some kind of universal value that everyone ought to have and cultivate. We should be as serious and focused as possible in all moments. But Saturn is frequently asking us to become more focused in particular ways at particular times within specific contexts. I don't think that all of the planets ask for the same thing. So some planets will be asking for some things, or might even be competing with other planets in terms of how to move through life. But Saturn frequently asks us, how are you growing wiser, more mature, and where are you becoming a little bit more serious or a little bit more focused because you need to? Okay, now that could be self-care. It could be in terms of being more boundaried in a relationship. It could be in terms of the development or cultivation of your craft if you're a practitioner of some kind. So it looks different, right? Depending on where it lands. That's one of the main reasons we do horoscopes, to get a better idea of where that focus might be taking place. If you think about Saturn, we talked about this yesterday, but if you think about Saturn as a planet who is exalted at the harvest time of the fall equinox, that symbolic space of the solar year from the relative orientation of the northern hemisphere, got to put that in there so we remember this is symbolic, doesn't matter which hemisphere you live in. Then we go to Capricorn and Aquarius. It's 2 home signs where darkness is the greatest, but light starts rising. And in the middle of winter, where light is also steadily rising. We are talking about phases of life that Saturn is associated with, both symbolically in the solar year and literally in the arc of a human lifetime, that have to do with the weight and responsibility of being an adult. That's the Saturn return moment. How will I be an adult is a very important question. It doesn't have to look the same for everybody. Where do I need to be more serious or focused? Where am I building something? Where am I being asked to become more mature, less naive, more realistic? All of these kinds of things kind of imply an arc of seriousness and development that occurs as life goes on, and we're capable of handling more. We're capable of being better boundaried or better disciplined, or we're capable of staying closer to our values and our authentic truth as it lives in our hearts. All of these things, Saturn is really an ally for us on. So this is one question to consider within the horoscopes we're looking at today. The second one is, what limits or realities must I face? As the reality principle, it's not that Saturn is realer than any other planet. It's that there are different realities, many different realities that the planets represent. And the Saturnian reality is that which is necessary, that which can't be avoided or eliminated or repressed. In that way, ironically, Saturn sometimes feels oppressive, or Saturn will show up as repression. But one of the things that is usually behind oppression or repression is something that we have to face and deal with as a kind of confrontation with reality that can't be avoided. In the case of oppressors, it's like, not that I don't love the reality of oppressors any more than anyone else, but when you face oppressive forces in life, you have to square with the fact that reality includes them. And then it becomes about, how does the soul live with or work through the reality of oppressive forces? And what we find in that process is gold. It's the gold of a heart that is eternal, that has to, kind of stand on its dignity and work through something, and only allow for, let's say, oppression to take place in certain ways while fighting to retain that eternal dignity of the heart that can never be taken away from us. That's a valuable lesson that Saturn often brings us. Yes, there's obstacles, there's oppressive forces within yourself or other people, but how do you work with them? How do you move through them? What is the greater reality that you anchor yourself in when things threaten to oppress or depress you, right, in some sphere of material life? The other thing that Saturn brings up within us are just limits. When we come to recognize, well, I fail sometimes, I can't do certain things, something is just not working anymore, or there's disappointment, right? Those kinds of experiences are also essential because they typically involve having to face an uncomfortable or painful truth that someone or something, including ourselves, is limited, is mortal, is impermanent. Life includes suffering. I can't think of anything more meaningful than the process of retaining your belief and your connection to magic, hope, mystery, optimism, while also squaring up and facing these kinds of realities. I think, for example, I've said this many times on the show before, but Thich Nhat Hanh is one of my great role models. I mean, I never met him or anything, but I've read a lot of his books, listened to a lot of his talks. And what I love about him is there's no blinking in the face of the kind of teeth, the existential teeth of reality. He's a good Buddhist in that sense, right? But he is childlike, innocent, magical, wonderful, curious, wide-eyed, starry. There's no lack of any of that, while there's also this very sober kind of gravitas that he has. I think Saturn is gently making each of us into more luminous spiritual beings, where that luminosity doesn't stand in some kind of ignorant rejecting or ignoring of these darker Saturnian limits or realities that are part of embodied existence. So, where do I have to go through Saturn school but the point is, without losing my heart, my magic, my shine, my sparkle, my curiosity. Saturn doesn't want to strip those things from us. Saturn wants to deepen their relevance, to make those things more real. Weirdly, we have to sometimes face these things that feel threatening to the very state of that magic and wonder that we carry inside. That sense of hopefulness, it has to be tested and deepened and made into like a starry kind of like metal or something. I'm thinking of like lightsabers and mithril from Lord of the Rings, you know? Number 3, where will failure, loss, or obstacles appear as my teachers? And I basically just covered this in number 2. I sort of just went right into this, didn't I? So same idea, right? How do we evolve? How is the story of our life unfolding according to Saturn? It is where we are growing wiser, more focused, more serious, and we're enjoying that process. We're growing up and it feels good to grow up. And it doesn't mean that we have to lose our humor or our playfulness or our magic. Where are we reaching limits or facing those harder aspects of reality with realness? No glossing over it, but that doesn't mean we have to lose any of those childlike, beautiful, starry qualities. And again, where will failure, loss, or obstacles appear as my teachers, as my guides that I learn to trust? Not easy for any of us. It's easy for me to sit here and rattle this off and be like, isn't life great with Saturn? But it's not. Saturn sucks. I'm just kidding. I can say that only because I'm friends with Saturn. Okay. Well, I say I'm friends with Saturn, but Saturn's also like a teacher, all respect, because Saturn could knock me on my ass at any moment. So let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and go back to... Let's go to our horoscopes. So what I want you to think about as we go through this reminder of house topics for Saturn is, how will I evolve along the lines that we've just covered? Okay, so these are brief house reminders. If you are, and as I say, listen to your rising sign. That corresponds to the whole sign house version of your birth chart, which is what Hellenistic astrologers like myself utilize in our practice. And so horoscopes are done in whole sign. It makes the most sense to listen to your rising sign if you want the transit location in your whole sign birth chart. If not, listen to your sun, listen to whatever you prefer. It's all good. So Aries, we're talking about the first house. Where will you mature or grow wiser as an individual person who has an individual psychology and character and behavior? How are you being forced to grow wiser, more serious in terms of your self-concept? It's very personal. It's very psychological. It could be even physical and related to things like health and self-care. What kind of feedback are you going to be open to accepting with respect to how you need to learn and grow as a person with a personality? When we go to Taurus, we see Saturn going into the 12th house. One thing that I like about the 12th house is for Saturn is that Saturn rejoices there naturally. When I think about Tauruses as Venus-ruled creatures, it's not, oh, and I'm a Taurus rising, so I know this, it's not always easy to be assertive or more aggressive or standing apart from others because it feels uncomfortable to a Venusian type of personality. Saturn in the 12th might be about, how do you stand alone? How do you stand apart? How do you take a stand for yourself? Sometimes that happens by having to stick up for yourself or having to confront or deal with hostile people or forces, or even looking at unconscious dimensions of yourself that are more aggressive or angry or belligerent or confrontational or mean that you don't necessarily see all the time because it's unconscious. You project a Venus type of vibe, a Venus earthy type of vibe, and yet there might be this hidden part of you. I would say that the exploration of individuality through things like solitude, or even taking time apart, or developing parts of yourself that stand apart from others or that are not as concerned with harmony, could also be a focus. So consider that 12th house as a blind spot or a somewhat unconscious spot where you have to look at things that undermine you, that help or harm you, kind of behind the scenes quietly, and also parts of yourself that need to come forth more or need to be looked at because they are problematic. All right, well, with Geminis, we're moving Saturn into the 11th house. That is the place of friends, allies, the social, communal, organizational facet of public social life. It is a place that also pertains to your aspirations and your long-term goals and dreams. there is a sense with Saturn in Aries in the 11th that you might be coming into a period of time where you have to go it alone, where your allies will be refined or reduced, and there may be more of a spirit of independence or of blazing your own trail. Maybe that ultimately leads you to new people, new groups, new social connections that are meaningful, but it may start off as having to sort of, take to a trail that's of your own making, and maybe even depart from certain comfortable allies or groups that you've been a part of. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a degree of disillusionment with or facing various limitations or hard realities with respect to social, professional circles or larger community dynamics that connect you to the larger world out there. So there's work to be done in this area, refinement to that will take place for Geminis. When we go along to Cancers, we see Saturn in the 10th house, which is that public, social, career house. It's also, I always like to try to mention this, but sometimes I forget, but for retirees, it's what connects you to the public world. For people who don't yet have a job, it's what's slowly developing the role or place you will play in the world. So, and then for people who are in, that kind of career vocational space, even if you're a full-time parent, it's the work that you do, it's the practice that you have, and it's the process of trying to establish a name, a reputation, a series of skills that maybe set you apart, that you're known for. So Saturn here suggests a period of great refinement, of greater focus, maturation, sometimes dealing with aspects of yourself publicly, socially, that are in need of greater maturing. Like you have to grow up somehow in your career, or you're going to have more responsibility given to you. And, with great power comes great responsibility kind of thing. This is also about looking at maybe things like power and figures of authority and issues that come up around those dynamics, either within yourself and how you wield power, or those that you work for or under and how you get along with them. These are the kinds of things I would keep my mind open to as a Cancer. Now, for Leos, we're looking at the 9th house. This is the place where we shape and form our beliefs, our understanding of truth on the highest universal levels, or even an understanding of truth that exists within a particular discipline like math or medicine or astrology. So in the pursuit of truth, we have teachers, we have wisdom schools, we have universities, we have religious institutions. This is also a place that refers to the higher laws of the universe and a trickle down to the laws of a society. And so Saturn in this house could be about issues around things like ethics, morality, law, lawfulness, but also about the pursuit of real truth and the process of doubt and skepticism and inquiry. What kinds of teachers, gurus are the best fit? Which of those teachers wield authority and power over a subject in a way that resonates with you versus those that don't? Sometimes there's a process of refinement around who or what we learn from, or how our beliefs are shaping or changing. So that all of that could be a very interesting part of the unfolding that you're experiencing over the next couple of years. Remember that Saturn is going to spend about 2.5 years in the sign of Aries. We covered that yesterday, so I didn't labor that timeline so much today. But anyway, Virgo rising puts Saturn into the 8th house. I'm actually, been thinking a lot about the 8th house because I'm giving a talk at NORWAC on the 8th house this weekend. As I'm making this, you'll be listening to this right prior to me giving a talk at NORWAC about the 8th house. The 8th house, I like to think of as the place of karmic debts. There is a give and take, a kind of reciprocity that exists here. Even if you think of that kind of cheesy Lion King song, The Circle of Life. Everything moves in a circle in this world. One thing eats another thing. One thing needs another thing for its existence. And then it dies and it becomes the source of food or life for another thing. And that cycle of life and death moving endlessly has a give and take to it. And the 8th house really highlights the place of life where we experience that give and take, where I owe things to people because of what they have owed me or given me, either in past lives or this life. So these kinds of karmic dynamics, the give and take, Sometimes they give in ways that are really amazing. This house is connected with the assets and resources of other people that can bless our lives, including things like inheritance, or the things that are coming to us when people in the family die, and they give them to us, in their will. But then also, it's about the attachments that I have and the inevitable process of having to relinquish attachments, which is why the eighth house is not only a place of debt, but also death. All of us have an attachment to the body we have to relinquish at some point. Deal about the relinquishment of attachments and the way in which those agreements that we have with other people go through periods of change. It could be something simple like, a rental contract at an apartment, or it could be something deeper like the kinds of emotional bonds and attachments and the give and take of those relationships karmically that are being reviewed or changed or altered. Or we have to look very carefully, if you're a Virgo, at what kinds of dynamics are fair and equal versus those that take or demand too much. So these are, some deep social karmic dynamics that are being looked at, as well as the kind of give and take of what people give versus what you give, things like that. All right, let's continue on to Libra. For Libra, the evolutionary Saturn is moving into your seventh house, the place of love and relationships and interpersonal dynamics. Now, this house was called Kama, as in the Kama Sutra, as in the experience of pleasure. And there's a natural way in which life has to be about pleasure and happiness in existence with other beings. Saturn in this house can suggest that there's a period of time where certain people just aren't going to cut it any longer in terms of what makes you happy. Or you're going to have to look at the shadows of a person that you love, or you're going to have to look at your own shadows as they exist in a relationship because of the valuable mirror that someone else is providing you with. Either way, there's a season of life now where the unfolding of the script and the language in that script are all about relationships and happiness. And where does growth need to take place within them, which can mean evolution within an existing relationship, or in terms of which ones you get into or get out of. And that could be romantic, but also it could pertain to other kinds of interpersonal connections in general. And that could also cover things like sexuality and intimacy and happiness and how it's experienced in any kind of relationship that you're in right now or that you're thinking about getting into. With Scorpio, Saturn goes into the sixth house, which is a place of work, sacrifice, labor, also hardship, and the difficulties that we have to overcome, especially in relation to things like work, career, material security, income, resources. And so if you get sick, naturally it is hard because now you've got an obstacle to overcome just so you can feel well and safe and okay in your body. If you are in school, you have to work really hard and sacrifice and labor a lot and overcome that process that we all have to overcome when we're like apprenticing in order to be able to sustain and support life and make money and get a good job. So the sacrifice, work, and labor is emphasized for Scorpios. This is a time in life where there's going to be a lot of effort. There's going to be a lot of work, and there's going to be a lot of strain in a sense. But can it be sacred? Can it be leading you to a bountiful harvest down the road? Absolutely. Saturn in the sixth house will reward hard work. If you take the time to care for your body, to develop stronger immunity, to be the healthier, happier version of yourself because of the effort you put in, you will be rewarded typically with Saturn in the sixth. I say that as someone born with Saturn in the sixth, but with Aries, the dignity of Saturn is such that, there might be some struggles and the need to persevere and find courage and strength with what you're building, what you're growing, what you're working on, what you're overcoming. So I think about that for Scorpios. Moving on to Sagittarius, Saturn's in the fifth house, a place that is associated with the satisfaction derived from the soul's dharma. This is about connection with other people, creatively, romantically, but it's also about a sense of being in touch with a creative essence that brings you joy and happiness within yourself as well as in relation to others. So that creative level of fulfillment, this is a house that also taps into things like pregnancy, children, and the the satisfaction of let's put it, I don't know if it's satisfaction, but the process of understanding who you are as an essential being for those of us who are parents, and not saying everyone needs to be, but for those of us who are parents, the children provide an incredible mirror for who we really are, because we'll see it reflected in them in certain ways, and they'll provide mirroring for us, and we can get closer to the essence of who we are, that brings joy, that brings happiness, that is creatively fulfilling. Children are an incredible mirror for parents for the sake of the creative dharma of the soul and its creative fulfillment, because in a sense, we have to look at that through the process of raising kids who are our creative products. So much more than a product, obviously, but you get what I mean. So anyway, the level of creative fulfillment, satisfaction, the reward of being in touch with our creative essence, Saturn wants you to really seriously look at this. Look at what's blocking you. Look at what's helping you. Face hard realities, suffer and work to find your creative essence, even if necessary. But you can do that work, and it's going to be creatively fruitful if you take the time to do it. So for Capricorns, we look at the movement of Saturn in Aries in your fourth house, the place of home, family, roots. Things like land and property, your actual living environment, are all things that we can see in this space. The parental history and karma. Again, if you're a parent, parental karma can come up here too. If you have a family karma of your own or of your family of origin can be linked to this transit. How are you growing wiser, more mature, more focused with respect to the cultivation of an inner life that's private, the resting sphere of life, the domestic sphere of life? There might be more of a call to develop that if you're someone who's just way too socially wrapped up and identified with work and people. No, come inward. What will bring you inward from Saturn is interesting. Also, what limits or realities do you have to face and work through in order to grow with respect to your history, familial history, ancestral karma? And where will failure, loss, obstacles appear in relation to things like home and family that will also be such a vital part of how you continue learning and growing right now? These are the things that I'm looking at for Capricorns. For Aquarians, we see Saturn in the third place, a place that's associated with siblings, but a place that I love the way Indian astrologers look at the third house. I think alongside of the Hellenistic understanding, I feel like I've really filled out my the way that I look at and understand the third house myself. One of the ways that we look at the third house is obviously in relation to things like siblings or peers, but there was also this kind of competitive nature to the third house in relation to peers or siblings that Indian astrologers have been very clear about. And I like that, because something about Saturn in the third house can show up as, how are you getting along with people that are sort of like your siblings or your peers? And there could be some need to learn how to stand apart or how to better integrate or harmonize. Either of that dichotomy could show up strongly with Saturn in the third, especially for Aquarians who are often working with that tension between standing apart and being a part of something. So I could see that happening with respect to people who are sort of your equals or peers. Do you need to, let go of the constant urge to always be different or apart or other? Or do you need to work on, caring too much about popularity? In either direction, we could see something here. I also like this house as a place where we develop skills and intellect, a kind of street smarts, capacities within ourselves, both psychologically and maybe materially, that contribute to being liked and having a good, positive social experience in life. But it's also based on some level in the third house on the merit of the skills and abilities that we cultivate, the intelligence we develop. So the Saturn in the third house could reflect a refinement or a deepening of your skills, intelligence, abilities, even psychologically, how you get along with other people might be something that you're looking at. Now, when we move on to Saturn in the second for Pisces, our final sign, we're looking at a place that is truly about the development of material security, comfort, ease, prosperity. And it's about being resourced. being resourced not just financially and materially, but being resourced in terms of the things that can help provide that material security for us, and then moving up from security, enjoyment. Saturn in this house could put you in touch with a lot of hard work that needs to be done. It's like plowing, tilling, gardening, working. Saturn in the second has, I think, a very productive quality behind it if we do the work and if we're very content to play the long game and see the long-term process that is being cultivated. The cultivation of resources, the cultivation of business products or abilities or skills that contribute to money or wealth or resources. Sometimes with Saturn in the second, it takes time. We have to weed things out that aren't working. We might even go through a period where we feel like we're a little limited, or we're dealing with the fear of deprivation, or the fear of privation, like we're not going to have enough. But in my experience, that Saturn's meaningful challenge is like, keep working, take a long view. The narrowing or limiting feeling that you're dealing with is not going to be there forever. But it is asking for a different kind of focus, or a different attention to detail, or a different set of skills that is maybe needing to be developed or deepened somehow. But looking at the slow, gradual, mature facing of challenges and developing of new resources, and the focus in that house for Pisces, I think for me, it's like, at least it's out of your first house. The first house is like so much more, I don't know, it's just like, it's weightier. I think Saturn in the first is a lot heavier most of the time than what people experience with it in the second, where there's more of a sense of it's something you're working with than something that's working on you. So anyway, that's maybe subjective, but yeah, take it for what it's worth. So I will end today's talk there.